The next speaker will be Lorenzo.
Thank you, Jürgen. It's always a pleasure to be here. As I was coming from the station, I realized that actually my first time in Japan was 10 years ago here at Nanzan as a master student. So life, it's and again, this is we're talking about Nietzsche, and so it's funny in theme. So I'm going to discuss a little bit the idea of is there no return? So my provisional title, Maybe It's Not Perfect, was Back to the Highest Peak and Return to the Deepest Source. Nishitani's joint reading of Nietzsche and Eckhart. And of course, I'm gonna, like some of the speakers before, I'm gonna focus a little bit more on Nietzsche, because I think I'm slightly more competent when it comes to Nietzsche rather than Eckhart. But again, in the title, I went for two vertical metaphors. And both of them are some kind of returning. So we have a recurring movement, and my focus in this paper is how this temporal aspect is expressed in true vertical metaphors. It's embodied in vertical terms. So it was a real pleasure listening to Alessandro before, because it was his reflection on watery depths, on sinking as an image. I think it was extremely on spot. It was extremely I completely agree with this connection with Butler. But then of course, the other part and parcel of this downwards movement of the overflowing and the sinking is also beginning from an idea of transcendence, beginning from this idea of vertical elevation, which is one of the basic metaphors for transcendence. The whole of Zarathustra begins on a mountain, going up to the top of a mountain and then going down. And in general, while there's an aspect of sinking, of dissolving, or diving into things that is mystical, but then very much not just in a Christian context, but in many other cultural contexts, we have this idea of transcendence, which is supposed to be experienced as a kind of flight, as a kind of elevation. And it's very much these two movements are joined into one in Zarathustra in a way that I find extremely interesting, also for an embodied theory of mysticism. So I will, as I was trying to reflect, I'm starting from this quote by Nishitani, in which he's arguing, I have tried to pick up what are what are thought to be the respective fundamental dispositions of Nietzsche's Zarathustra and Meister Eckhart, without traversing the entirety of their individual teachings. Which, of course, it's what Nishitani is doing. It is also what I'm trying to I'm trying to be just as modest, even if I can, even more so with my approach, because of course he's recognizing also that each possesses his own historical atmosphere, colored by the characteristics of this time. So he's making a juxtaposition that is actually quite bold, I would say. But the boldness of this hermeneutical move is also interesting because I think that in Nishitani's essay he's taking the object. So his method and his object are kind of coinciding, because what happened is that he's saying, I must acknowledge there is something in the recesses of such historical differences that flows in common at the bottom of the respective ways of thinking. So it's not just dealing with something he's thinking that both of these authors have dealing with something that's called Kongenteki, ursprünglich, but they also have this commonality. What also characterizes them as what also allows to read them in a tandem together. The deep flow is the way in which Nishitani is able to read together the two authors, despite the chronological and biographical differences, the atmosphere, the colors, which might be different. So this is already a first interesting, a philosophical approach, a theoretical approach to making a very different. So he's not just making a comparison between them. He's arguing that they have something essentially and hidden, some hidden depths in which there's a common flow. And they are also dealing with that in terms of content. So their thought is a fundamental insight into absolute unity. He's using this metaphysical notion of life or non-eidetic transcendence. Can we not see, that's also another Nishitani quote, that can we not see that both paths unexpectedly near the peak or at the elemental source of this great life? So I have like three open questions. I mean, like I have some kind of like a spoiler, like a very provisional, like instinctive answer, but like each one of them will need to be argued. So first of all, one of my questions in approaching this text was, is the categorical life employed by Nishitani as a common denominator between Nietzsche and Eckhart a viable notion to read them together? Because it seems to be whatever, like, I mean, whatever we want to define it, like when he's talking about life, we know that for sure, like it's an important metaphysical notion in Christianity. Like in Nietzsche has this like long, surely like a kind of influenced by this Lebensphilosophie, but in both cases, this is not a clear philosophical category. It's not for sure. It's not a begriff, not an author. And then one more question, actually, maybe I'll be focusing more on this one, but are there other elements in Nietzsche's work, and especially in the Zarathustra, which can or should be included in such a comparative effort? Yeah, my answer is yes, and I find striking that Nishitani is not actually dealing with what is considered, like at least by Heidegger. I mean, like given that his text is producing like in a relationship with Heidegger. Heidegger considers the Zarathustra as the text that's dealing with eternal return, with eternal recurrence. Nishitani is barely mentioning that in his text. And I think it's a really interesting point. Like it's a really interesting, like possible direction of expansion, not to criticize Nishitani, but because I want to see how much of this reflection works when we focus on, again, what might be the main point, like the main intuition, the main need for Nietzsche as he started writing the Zarathustra. And then, I mean, but this is maybe the least interesting. Like, again, it seems that nobody here is having a problem with that. But is Nishitani and the Kyoto School somehow betraying Nietzsche in just exposing his atheism and a major Christian mystic like Eckart? Spoiler, apparently not. Where I found this quote by Brian Schrader that says, few philosophers today would identify Nietzsche as a radical theological thinker, but his thinking is in fact deeply theological at heart. And the death of God is most profound and misunderstood theological observation. This might be like this might be worth, I don't know if I completely agree with Schroeder, but like there seems to be a consensus that we can read Nietzsche within a theological discussion. And like at the very end, I'll try to see if there's something like in particular, like some particular themes and like lines of Eckart that we can read in a Nietzschean way. But like that's probably like something that needs to be discussed first in a different moment. And as I was looking for like some slides background, I found this really interesting painting from the early 30s by Nicholas Roerich. Like he's Russian painter, but like was a Theosophian, had a very international life. I think he died in India. And he was illustrating a bit of Zarathustra. And we find, I mean, like Nishitani is also like justly focusing on the idea of the overflowing cup, like justly focusing on the meeting of the saints halfway on the mountain. But this scene, and of course, I mean, it's a sunset. So like we have this Zarathustra just before, at the very beginning of everything, it's the beginning of the Untergang. But it's a mountain. So, and again, like this scene of the elevation, I mean, so the whole point, in order to go down, in order to sink in the water, there needs to be like a apparently completely different connection to air. So the mountain doesn't seem to be earth, and it seems to be more about like an elevation into heights. Like in Zarathustra, on top of the mountain. So on top of the mountain, he's bringing together, let's say, he's bringing together earthen and aerial and the sky. Like he's talking, like his companions are what? And a snake and an eagle. So he's bringing together the highest height and some deep rooting, some deep grounding. So, like for me, it will become more evident as I keep talking. I hope. But like, so the story of Zarathustra is one of vertical movements, and like these vertical movements is not just going up high, it's not just going down. It's both at the same time, and that like this paradoxical unity of verticality will appear in different moments. It's like Nietzsche's, I would say, most intense dialectic because it's felt in the body, and the originality of Nietzsche's verticality, yes, instead it's an embodied dialectic, a double movement in which rising and falling are like essentially identified. Peak and abyss, they are now merged as one. Granting, or again in Nietzsche, granting that I'm a decadent, I'm the opposite as well. I'm a beginning, I'm an Ursprung. Or again, when we see like when the spirit of gravity is telling to Zarathustra, oh, like you're a stone, like you've been thrown high, and as everything was thrown high, so gravity is not just falling down, gravity is the possibility of a dunamis, like going up, and at the same time feeling all the heaviness. So, and the fact that this double movement is recurring so much, like makes me argue that like Zarathustra is like of all Nietzsche's places, it's a book about verticality, it's a book about like a double embodied movement. And this is connected actually to his idea of reason and return. So transcendence in general, and I mean, this verticality, this original take on verticality for me is important because transcendence is easily thought as a vertical dimension, not just in Nietzsche, of course, like anywhere. The mountain scene of the Zarathustra is an example of ascetic practices that are common to the East and West. But Zarathustra is taking this vertical movement in an even more radical manner, with a stress on breathing, animal companionship, such as the Clonia snake and their eagle, or the paradoxical conjunction of lightness and weight. And yeah, I mean, this is just like a parallel, but of course, I mean, so Zarathustra looks in some moments very, very close to the kind of like the Chavetien, the Senin, like we have from the first chapter of Zhuangzi, which again is like some kind of praise of lightness. But we have the description of like this like immortal from Guayi Mountain that dwells as who dwells. It's like he's a spirit like man with skin like Isis, no, lovely and chaste as a virgin, so somehow like maiden-like, childlike. He eats no grain, but sucks the wind and drinks the dew. He mounts the chi of the clouds and wanders beyond the four seas riding a flying dragon. By concentrating his spirit, he protects things from illness and damage, and he ripens the fallow harvest. A man such as he, with virtue such as his, can roll the world of things, the 10,000 things into one. Through flood waters rise to the sky, he will not drown, again, by waters. Though I drove those metal and stone and scorch a soul in the mountains, he will not be burnt. So like, these kind of like, he's not just being an ascetic, but like being in this state of like height, like going with the flow, being able to go extremely up, means also to be free to go down, to go down in waters without drowning, to be like able in the fire with a misfortune, and again, to can roll the world of things into one. There's a promise of unity that comes from these like embodied transcendence. And again, I mean, this is like, I don't want to delve into biography, like it's any kind of biographic, psychologistic or psychiatric reading would be like, no, it's too easy a reduction. But it's very important for me that like the fall of Zarathustra, apparently, I mean, this is also Heidegger's reading, is that Nietzsche had in La Silva Plana, in La Sis Maria, a kind of experience, like his own mystical experience. And the whole of Zarathustra, and he felt that like, he could not talk about it. So like that, this kind of experience was forbidden, like impervious to normal language. And he said, oh, well, in order to be able to speak like that, I had to wait at least 10 years. He couldn't wait 10 years, but he chose to create a character much better than his, the real Superman, who waits 10 years and then goes down to tell about it. So, and he's talking a bit about these like psychological process in Ecce Homo. And now I wish to relate the history of Zarathustra, the fundamental idea of the work, the eternal recurrence, the highest formula yes into life that can never be attained. So he's being very clear here. Was first conceived the month of August 1881. I made a note of the idea on a sheet of paper with a postscript, 6,000 feet beyond man and time. So this vertical elevation is not just happening in physical space, it's time related. I was in the lake of Silva Plana, behind a huge rock that towered off like, it was then the top structure. So like on top of a mountain, Nietzsche has this vertical transcendence, which is not just happening in space, but is essentially related to time. And Nishitani would show a very deep, so I don't want to criticize Nishitani because, for instance, like in Religion and Nothing, in Sukha to Ananta, he has a very interesting, like a very deep understanding of it. So I don't think it's an essential problem with this 1938 essay. But is this a meaningful omission, I have to ask? And is this absence connected with the attempt of bringing Nietzsche in a dialogue with Eckart? So, because the point, like, so in my understanding, the essential quality of the eternal return, of the eternal recurrence in Nietzsche, is not about the circularity, not about an objective understanding of time as a repeating element, but like this time is felt vertical. And that's why it's completely intensive and related to the body. Like, because again, like time happens as an hourglass, as a weight. So this is the very, very famous passage from the end of gay science, in which what if someday or night a demon were to steal into loneliest loneliness and say to you, this life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once again and innumerable times again, and there will be nothing new in it. But every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unspeakably small or great in your life must return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Even this pie there and this moonlight between the trees and even this moment and I myself. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned over and again, and you with it, speck of dust. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you was eventually, you're a god and never had anything more divine? So what if we take these moments, this specific moment of Zarathustra, which seems to have been related to whatever happened to Nietzsche in Silva Plana in 81, what if this is the meeting with God? So like, what if the demon and the God, so this negativity and positivity, related to time, related to a time that like an hourglass, where like we keep going up and down with us. If that's really the moment in which I am negating myself into God, but also God is negating myself into me, like in this very intensive and recurring moment. And this emptying of the self, I mean, it seems very much to be connected. So like the eternal return, according to Heidegger, is some kind of like, it's a rupture of the logic, it's a rupture of any kind of theological or teleological the transcendence, but also like he's arguing in the second Nietzsche that the sin of the loneliest loneliness, the dialogue with the demon or God, is also prior and beyond every distinction between I and thou. So this is the moment of essential unity, and Karaki Junzo, like he's like much lesser known Japanese philosopher thinker, he's writing in the Poetry in Decadence, so from the early 50s, much after Nishitani, but he's talking about, he's thinking of Nietzsche as a decadent, he's making a really interesting comparison with, say, Basho, Ikki, and Baudelaire, and of all these people that have this like tendency to become one with the environment and having the impression that their own self is thinking itself with things, in a unity with things. Karaki uses a wonderful expression that I borrow, is like central self-consciousness, kankaku na jikaku, and again, like the heaviest weight is a thought that thinks itself outside of a singular subject and seems to push on the subject from the outside, atmospherically, and the eerie stillness and the sputter in the moonlight are equally essential to this insight, possibly more than the sense of being a subject at its center. So this emptying of the subject happens in the moment, happens in a moment that we have the impression that we're going to live forever, and in a sort of connection, in a sort of like unity with things, in which like a subject is displaced. That's why the divine and demonic elements are essentially the same. And again, we have that this embodied voice, which seems more like a demonic Socratic demon, or of course a kind of madness, happens again in Zarathustra. So when he says that my stillest hour spoke to me, that is the name of my terrible mistress. So like this power, again, it's not, this mystical experience is like actually very disquieting. I mean, it's close to madness, it's close to some kind of possession, again, but it's connected to eternal return, and it's connected to this feeling of heaviness and flight at the same time. So like the mountain, the watery depths, the overflowing cup, like the sense of being a stone thrown in the air and destined to fall again and again. It's like it's a moment that reminds very much the image of Sisyphus that Baudelaire is using in his own like theory of eternal recurrence. But then again about water and about some kind. There's a poem by Nietzsche that's related to this like mystical experience that I would like to read with you as I'm approaching to the end of this like jumbled reflection. Okay, I read in English. There's that waiting, yet for naught, transcending good and evil, sometimes caught in light, sometimes caught in shadow, all game, all sea, all midday, all time without aim. This is actually that's the English translation is from the Cambridge Companion, but it's really weird because See is clearly the lake. I mean, he's not talking about the sea while he's in Switzerland. I have no idea why, but I'm quoting from the Cambridge translation. It's a weird mistake. But anyway, so like this, let's take this one as an expression of the being one with things like this. This would seem, this watery nature, and again, like time, like this timelessness seems to be extremely important for him. So like eternally waiting, being beyond good and evil, so like transcending, first of all, this kind of like dual and say relational. This kind of like these relative parameters are like transcending in this moment, but the temporality is really strong. And then there's a kind of identification with what? With everything. Because like he's in light, in shadow, all game, ganz Spiel, and ganz nur Spiel, okay, that's not just a game. I mean, it would be like this sense of freedom, of lightnesses, like just to be able to freely wander again, like a Taoist immortal, all midday, all time without aim. And this being 6,000 feet beyond man and time that is taking seems to me to be a very good model for mystical religious experiences. Denial of linear time is what makes possible the emptying of the self described by Nishitani. I don't understand why he's not stressing that in his own essay, because it's fundamental, at least in Nietzsche. Like, and I'll go again, like I'll get a couple of quotes by Eckart, but I want to hear more from you about those because they also deal with time. But then the emptying of self, and also the rupture of the eidos of a self that in this moment becomes eternally ever-flowing in the midst of being as a whole and beyond a mere logical identity. Ganz See, ganz Mitte, ganz Zeit, ohne Ziel. But however, like that's my problem. I mean, when I was hearing before the idea of like playing in the water, or like having a more or less religious faith, but I want to see what you think of one more possible take about this kind of like interfusion with things. Because we could read Cismaria or the mystical experience in Zarathustra, not as philosophers of religion, like Nishitani is, but simply as phenomenologists, taking this insight in central subconsciousness, like Harake Junzo, or describing the same process through the idea of Ausleibung, excorporation, as Hermann Schmitz does. Hermann Schmitz, philosophers of atmospheres, Neue Phänomenologie, actually from the like 60s, late 50s, 60s, like he died recently, I mean, I think like 3 years ago. But he's taking this very poem by Nietzsche, this very idea, and of course it's not just about Nietzsche, like his general idea of mystical experience is read through a very dry phenomenological notion that he connects to like the general, his general like philosophy of the body that he developed, like say in around 40 years. But at the same time, sinking into excorporation, Ausleibung, and insofar as this concentration lasts. So again, it's something that is temporary on a linear time, but then feels infinite in intensive terms. Be a deepening that extracts from its object poignant absolute impression, but only as absolute kinds, like Haniata, at the expense of the detailed exactness of a singular case, of grasping individual elements with no further cases below them. So he's giving a very some kind of like phenomenological reduction of what's happening in this kind of absolute experience, sunken in the landscape which for him has condensed itself into absolute impressions of lake, midday, and infinite time. Nietzsche can exist here as a whole into whence it germinates. So like this kind of situation is deeply creative, it's like healing, like it's Schmitz is not denying the value like he is a phenomenologist, so of course he's just describing things actually. He's not judging at all, but he's kind of limiting that. This is just a special conformation of what? Like or what he calls the vital drive. Basically, it's all about bodily grammar. And that's why this vertical movement, like this double vertical movement connected to time, is so important. The special vastness into which the narrowness of the felt body pours through its corporation here is replaced by the temporal endlessness of awaiting. This exemplary case of exploration into a landscape shows us how landscape can also heal, unburdening us from the abusing corporation to what we encounter and what pressures us, creating an opening for a deep dive into the undivided impressions of absolute qualities. So there is an importance, which is like, so Schmitz is not exactly going like Freud when he's saying, oh, but this is just an oceanic feeling. So like, which is like very reductionistic, like take on religious experiences. For him, like this kind of like going outside of our own body, like having this like literal overflow, not of the physical body, but of light. Of course, is a healing process, and there's and again, we wouldn't discover what absolute qualities outside of this situation. But this is just like breathing. This is just one of the poles of experiences, and then naturally we're gonna be back. So there's so his idea, I think he has a lay idea of these mystical experiences because he takes them as a special case of something, of like leibliche Kommunikation, so like how the body is immersed into an environment in a way that it's maybe similar to Bachelard. So like we have in a constant communication with matter, with these pure impressions, with other bodies. And actually, according to Schmitz, most of the meaningful things, most of our meaningful dealings with the world are actually not Ausleibung, so excorporations, but like Einleibung, so the way in which we go on and communicate with other people, with other things as well, like synesthesias or synesthesia, like kinetic suggestions, like being with other people. This is for him in a way. This is more relevant, but he's describing that in a dry but not dismissive way. And this is and he's quoting another interesting. He's not quoting it in full, but I think he's referring to this here by Heidegger. And this is the kind of Unio Mystica. I'm sorry, I should be like Unio Mystica has been popularized as the magic of sunset by the sea, satirized by Heine. So like just a generation after Nietzsche, like basically right again, very close to Nietzsche, just a generation before. A girl sat by the ocean, sighing long and longingly for she was much affected by the sunset on the sea. And somebody saying, my lady, this old story, allow me to ease your mind. It goes down here in front of us and comes back from behind. So that's all. I mean, like, of course, we're going to be deeply affected by the sunset. But we can also, let's say, demystification is just as important. So like, we have to be able to go back and forth between these stances. So, and then Schmitz is adding about, like, let's say, when Nietzsche say, oh, all light, all midday, all time without aim. And again, I think also a bit like satirically, Schmitt is arguing, in contrast to the letter of the original claims, none of these are true identities, since an identity would have to be reversible. And again, this is like surprisingly connected to the problem of mysticism, of like God becoming human and human being becoming God, rather than having like just a sensational identity. If A is identical to B, then B must also be identical to A. But while Nietzsche is all C and all midday, it is not the case that then C and the midday are all Nietzsche. But Nietzsche, Schmitz recognizes the healing power and especially the authority of these absolute impressions, which are real, and the proof of a state of communion present into the individual existence of simple parties. So, what actually happens in Unio Mystica and in subject-object sublation of the impression is not an identity between the two parties, but instead it is that the involved party finds themselves in an absolutely indivisible relationship with Beziehung, one that cannot be broken down into a connection, a Verbindung. So he's distinguishing in his system the difference between a Beziehung and Verbindung is extremely important because a relationship can be absolutely divisible. And these are the kind of cases that like mystics like Nietzsche are like experiencing and trying to convey towards. Referring to the same partner, not overall, but connecting to something else outside of it. So like in these moments of unities, they are absolute, they become an ausleibung because we have absolute impressions and everything else is kind of sublated into this moment of unity. Indeed, even for Smith, there is a kind of ontological and priority of this state, which he calls the chaotic manifold, and which has therefore not just an emotional validity, but also an epistemic one, but not a theological one, obviously. So like he's completely, so this kind of transcendence is a transcendence of the body, in the sense I think it's like somehow still very much thinking with Nietzsche. He's not that far, but he's reducing some of these elements. And about time, so like again, Nietzsche, especially in Zarathustra, like the whole sense of transcendence of Zarathustra is about this eternal return. And as I was trying to argue, eternal return is something vertical. And this verticality is a verticality of the body. I mean, it's like it's happening through our body, within us. My argument is that somehow it's related to breathing, actually, as an eternally recurring moment of the same. But apart from that, I was trying to say, well, is there something especially about time in Eckart? And I did find something. I don't know him enough to make a full argument, and I'm out of time. But I've argued how the theme of time and its relationship to embodiment or life is necessary to understand Nietzsche's account of transcendence and union mystica. But we can say that Nishitani is implicitly touching this theme as he argues for a dialectic movement, or as he quotes multiple times, the Bergsonian understanding of life, something that cannot be frozen, should not be frozen into being and a shape. There needs to be as a kind of like a movement. But what is the take on time and temporality in the mysticism of indivisible relationship espoused by Eckart? And I found this like Eckart is arguing time is what keeps the light from reaching us. There is no greater obstacle to God than time. If anyone had the skill and the power to gather up time and all that has happened into 6,000 years, or that will happen till the end of time, into one present now, there will be the fullness of time. That is the now of eternity, in which the soul knows all things in God, new and fresh and present, and is as joyous as have them now present. Or again, there exists only the present instant, and now which always and without end is itself new. So it must be repeating itself, one might argue. There is no yesterday, nor any tomorrow, but only now, as it was 1,000 years ago, and as it would be 1,000 years hence. So I don't know. Like again, I just collected these quotes because, of course, I mean, if we say, "Oh, I'm going to read Eckart with Nietzsche," it might. I mean, if we just expose them, it sounds similar enough. We have this eternal now and so on, which seems to be a negation. Again, I'm not an expert, but it would very much seems to be a partly coming from also the kind of like Augustinian notion of time, like meeting God like in temporality and presence. But this is a just now, which is also a negation of progression, something that has to be repeat itself. And again, there's no greater obstacle to God than time. Doesn't sound Augustinian to me. But I think everybody else here knows much more about this specific thing than me. And so I just wanted to present you with these quotes from Eckart and see if you think they might be related to that, the missing piece of the puzzle that's like temporality in Zarathustra and how it's connected to this like a sense of interfusion with other things, with with a being that in that moment is kind of like ausleibend, like a body that is becoming one in a specific way, in a problematic way, with whatever is happening in the present age. Okay, thanks.
Lorenzo,
Question or comments? Yes.
please. Yeah, thank you very much. I liked the approach to the texts, kind of trying to bring these different ideas together. And I think, at least for me, we were able to help bring out some of the themes that have been coming out throughout today, and in a new shape that maybe can help me formulate a kind of response to them. The first was, this issue of how to connect verticality and the eternal return together. And so one of the texts that I had mentioned in my talk this Taisho no Choitsu, Taisho no Choitsu. So Nishitani does bring these two metaphors together explicitly. He actually mentions Nietzsche's eternal return. And this passage, which makes it so interesting, is so he's referring to this issue of the transition from the science of logic to the philosophy of nature. So this problem of how does the subjectivity, which is transparent to itself, how does it now become actualized in something outside of itself, beyond itself? And he refers to this transition as having a connection to the thinking of the eternal return. And he then explains, so what's going on here is that this not I, the other, or the nature, it's the product of the self reaching full maturation and then dropping off. Like so his metaphor here is like the child is birthed from the mother, the not I is birthed from the self, right? And what's interesting there is that the way that Nishitani connects the eternal return with this metaphor of verticality of falling and coming up is through life process, life cycle, right? And what's key there is that in his understanding of Aristotle, life is this self-overcoming. So his interpretation of arete in Aristotle, of virtue in Aristotle, is this capacity to go beyond what it was previously. So he talks about, well, the one that can play the lyre well, that means they're playing it better than the kind of standard expectation of it. The good lyre player is someone that's produced something new, right? So the productive capacity of life is what is able, at least at this time in the 20s and 30s, what brings the eternal return. So you have the return of this life cycle, but also the verticality of excellence of going and superseding that are connected together there. And that process of constant overcoming, that moment of overcoming or production or creativity is what brings the eternity into the moment, right? So I thought that was really helpful for me to see, okay, wow. So Nishitani has been thinking about Nietzsche, Hegel, and Eckhart here too. So when he mentions this moment when the not I is birthed from the I, he refers to that as what Eckhart calls Entwerden. Eckhart's there too, all the way from the early 20s.
When I argue that I don't want to be critical of Nishitani because he's an amazing thinker, he clearly understood Nietzsche really well. For instance, in religion and nothingness, it's really saying, I mean, Nietzsche is also saying the time is not spiritual, and the spirit of gravity is telling me, no. Don't make things too easy for yourself. And Nishitani is telling that very clearly. If I had a circular, like if I think that I can metaphorize time as a circular things, I'm outside of it. To have any kind of, again, geometrical shaping and so on, like to see something going in a circle, I have to assume that I'm already in a position outside of time. And that's why the one eternal recurrence is like, it's Sisyphus that we find in Baudelaire and possibly Nietzsche. He's thinking when he sticking the stone. That's my impression, but it might come from that. So that's the idea of Benjamin as well. But again, it's like it's popping up.
But that's unproductive though, right? Pushing the stone up and falling back down. There's no production there. So it is just.
And that's why, I mean, I would say that when we said, oh, but then you see the overcoming and so on, that's exactly the kind of theological thinking that both Baudelaire and then Benjamin and then and so on are refusing. That's why, like, the eternal return is the complete loss. In order to, like, we can, in time, I can say, oh, there's a progress, like we can go beyond. We cannot go beyond if we are just breathing, let's say, or like if it's one of the really good points for me. I mean, one of the really good points for me is in the Drunken Song when you say, oh, it's like there's a smell of eternity. It's like coming back with the night, and that's the thing. Like it's not going anywhere. Like every smell is like just like sinking and then reappearing. And that's the kind of thing we can expect. It's never going to be, beyond, better, and so on, but also never worse either. So that's so it has to be vertical because it's the only dimension of intensity. But then life is also like sinking, and rising. So this sense of like falling, sleeping, waking up, and so on. But we could say, of course, that the whole verticality of unconscious in Freud is uneasily taken from Nietzsche as well. It's another connection, another end of the connection. Thank you very much. I will of course check the Thais, not what to say.
That's right.
Thank you.
25 or something.
I'll check it out.
There's one other point that I wanted to catch on because this is interesting too. I think you raised the question, is it helpful to read Nishitani as a philosopher of religion or as a phenomenologist? And I think one of the really interesting answers, at least that Nishitani came up with in the 20s and 30s, was that the philosophy of religion is a kind of phenomenology. However, it's not Husserlian or transcendental phenomenology. It's Hegel's phenomenology, this interpretive process of understanding how, well, for Hegel, it would have been shapes of spirit. For Nishitani, it's how these forms of life come to be compelling, how they come to drive us, and maybe also fail to drive us anymore, as in the case of something like nihilism. But that is key because I worry that if we take the sort of transcendental phenomenologist perspective, as you said, we are working with mere description. We're no longer judging. And for Nishitani, the key thing at this time was that when we look at history, we are making judgments on history. We are making distinctions between good and bad. We are not in that sense. And so insofar as we're dealing with history, we're not beyond good and evil, I guess you could say.
I mean, this he's a phenomenologist, just a philosopher of religion. It's just a question that I'm very comfortable to leave out as I'm reading it, because I think it's useful. I mean, also phenomenologists, I mean, they claim the descriptive, but I don't think it's one of the other big lies. I mean, of course, they have an agenda, they're human. They're trying to be, but I mean, trying to be descriptive. There are some places in which I wish Nishitani were a bit more of a phenomenologist, because he's an excellent phenomenologist.
In the descriptive sense.
And in a descriptive sense.
Okay.
Yeah. Because like when he's dealing with religion and so on, like he becomes very much a theorist of culture with a strong agenda, with like that's where he gets a bit of like a how to say in a kind way, it becomes a bit of an apologetic tone and so on. And that's, I think sometimes it becomes weaker. I think it's something I because it's a perspective that is grounded extra philosophically. So it's grounded in life experiences that nobody's having in that moment, nobody's having in the specific order. But that's my one specific issue that I have with that. I mean, it needs to be, I feel that somehow it's a dialogue between people that share an extra philosophical concern.
That's true. Yes, that's right. That was one of the issues, is how do they relate philosophy to the outside of philosophy?
So, I mean, when Tobias was saying, oh, but it's the solution is baptism. As somebody who's not a Catholic anymore, I'm like, no, not for me. And that's the issue, because I know and I remember enough to say, yes, of course, for a Catholic, that's a beautiful, paradoxical solution and so on, and everything holds. But like for somebody who just not, I mean, I happen to be Roman, so I actually come from the cultural context, and yet it doesn't say anything to me. And or I might be from somewhere else. So like that's the issue of being, let's say, a restricted, like religion happens often to be a restricted dialogue, not just in a cultural sense, but also because it presupposes a certain concern. Maybe that's true for philosophy as well, but I think it's especially true for religion.
Yes, maybe.
Yes, well, I think at least 2 points. First point, you began your talk with the question in how Nishitani is justified in juxtaposing Nietzsche with Eckhart, and how these correspond, the self-proclaimed Antichrist and the Christian mystic. But I think in the text, in the reference text, Nishitani provides this, I think, a clue to an answer why he gives these two thinkers, in that he, and I see this also again as a kind of clue for a subtext in the text, or an undercurrent that Nishitani himself doesn't fully develop. When at the very end of the text, he goes into the sense of historical crisis that both Nietzsche and Eckhart, as he reads them, he argues, have reacted to, and why they, out of a kind of historical necessity, or maybe even, as we heard this morning from Professor Moore, in a kind of epochal sense of history, had to react against. And there I find interesting that it seems that in Nishitani's mind, the history of thought, the Western history of philosophy, is very much driven by theological issues, in the sense that he describes Eckart as being a reaction against the falling apart of the Thomistic synthesis, and Nietzsche as the reaction against the Kantian, the post-critical falling apart of what he sees as a parallelism between Thomas and Kant, in attempting to suture the gap between faith and reason, which is, I think, a suture which he doesn't go very much into, but which is a suture that is very much specifically Christian. And also the systematic attempt at suturing this gap, and one could argue paradoxically opening it up again, is also very specifically tied to Christian theology and the whole project of a systematization of the theology. And in a sense, the question of how philosophy and revelation can be brought into contact. But in any case, it seems that for Nishitani there is this broad historical narrative in the background of his thought that leads from Thomas to Kant, and is essentially, I would argue, a theological narrative in which he situates himself. And so, yes, I see the connection. So the question that you raised in the beginning, I see answered by him there. And in a sense, maybe one could even apply Nietzsche's words to that, in that it's very strange that Thomas, you could argue, represents in a certain sense the midday of Catholic theology, when the church was at the height of its power, and the Occident was very much the Christian world. Whereas with Nietzsche, or the post-Kantian modern situation, we have in a certain sense the midnight of the church, the midnight of the Christian world. But both are the same. Midnight is also a midday.
Yes.
When the same problem emerges again, essentially, and we find both times a specific reaction against a specific problem, a reaction. And a second point to the end with Schmitz and this phenomenological reading of the mystical experience. Again, I'm in disagreement with this reading, also because I see it going against the wording that Nishitani provides in his text, when he very, again, almost polemically, aggressively criticizes this idea of unification with God and unio mystica, and a kind of, in that sense, becoming at oneness. It seems to me that what he calls itsu, or the oneness, in the end, is more tied maybe to a vocabulary in Eckart of this breakthrough moment, or in Nietzsche, the overflowing, something that has to break, and that is precisely not at one in the sense of being unified or in union, but neither with the whole nor with the divine as transcendent other person, but something that is essentially at a loss with itself, maybe one could even say. So I do not agree with this Schmitzian reading of the mystical experience for that reason. Sorry, again, no question, but
No.
maybe
I think they are. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess that there's like 5-6 pages about the Ausleibung, and like he's not trying to go for a Schmitz. He's not going for a full theory of mysticism. But I do not. I mean, from what you said now, I generally think that he would like that your disagreement is in contrast with Schmidt's words actually, because it's like he's criticizing this idea of like non-complete this of logical unity when he's noting this is a non-reversible sense of loss of oneself. This is like outlining is what like of course he's giving a bodily reading, but it's basically any kind of like he calls it anger, tiredness. So like our sense of self, according to Schmidt, is based on a sense of like tiredness that is related to the absolute presence of myself, like the fact of like I cannot reverse myself without it. And in that moment, when I'm focusing and he's saying water, light, some like he's giving examples that are like coherent with what we're discussing, also in non-metaphorical terms. These things are kind of like provisionally, for a short time, they are going in the direction of such an overflow and loss of myself. So he's giving a very non-religious reading of that, but I don't think it's in like I don't think that the points you're like raising are actually a disagreement, which means like you can say that you don't have the same stance, but his wording is kind of consistent with what you say at least now. Then we should discuss and maybe I can give a better account of Schmidt's issues. But like I think he's not very easy to dismiss when he's describing that. The kind of like saying he's basically grounding a certain kind of mystical experiences, and again the overflow, the loss, like the kind of like the expansion in a bodily grammar. And I think rather than just like metaphysical unity or saying like Nishitani does life, which is like absolutely not explaining anything, or just jumping in a believer's perspective, which of course it's not mine and it's not Schmidt's. So it cannot be shared with people that don't already accept it. Your first point, yes, very much. I mean, maybe like you were out for a second. So I think the point is that the commonality that I was focusing on is that they share something. They share this interest for like this absolute unity at the core of life. So like his idea is also that they have this unity among them, but he's justifying taking them together because they're dealing with a sense of like hidden togetherness of things. But like the grand narrative about the history, like this theological history in Europe. Yes, like it's but my problem is that these kind of things can only be hindsight. And it seems to be again very Hegelian, very linear. So like in this sense, I don't know. I mean, yes, even Nietzsche surely saw himself as some kind of like ending and beginning of something. But he was explicit in that. I don't know how much Eckart would locate himself as within a cultural crisis of like Christian theology and so on. But I don't know. I mean, like whenever we look at history from in hindsight, we're going to see big patterns. And which is fine. I think it's like a very human thing to do, and that's how we understand things. And Nishitani is excellent at that. To believe that actually these patterns are what like structure, inform, and lead history internally, I'm a bit more skeptical, and especially with somebody dealing with and especially in the case of Nietzsche, so somebody who's like heavily criticizing with the idea of the eternal return, the idea of progressive time, and so on. So like it has a very complex and contradictory idea of history. So I feel it's a bit ungenerous to just see him. Also, I mean, like between Kant and Nietzsche, there's a whole lot of things. So like to see, oh yeah, this is a crisis of the kind of Kantian synthesis and so on. I mean, there's a lot of things that happen in between. And we could say that like the crisis of a Kantian synthesis is already in the post-Kantians. I mean, it has been a whole century. So it's yeah, I'm a bit more skeptical. Of course, I mean, these kind of narrations are good because they call forth our understanding of things. But like to follow him and actually believe that this kind of like ongoing structure seems too much to me. That's my in hindsight, of course, we can narrate. History is narration, so we need to narrate things. But to believe that actually there's a kind of like theological stream in the history of Western thought, I'm not sure.
Just a quick reaction to that, just very quickly. Then maybe in that regard, it's also interesting to just mention that although of course one can situate Eckhart clearly in broadly speaking the Christian tradition, still just as Nietzsche is a self-proclaimed antichrist, Eckhart famously is deemed a heretic by the church precisely for the points that interest Nishitani and that Nishitani favors and juxtaposes with Nietzsche. These are exactly the points, precisely this moment of oneness, mystical experience, and being able to almost merge with the Godhead, were precisely what part of the 26 or 7 points that are on the list of the inquisitors for being not orthodox theology. So to say that Eckhart is a kind of representative of Christian thought, precisely in those points, I find also problematic. Rather, I find it interesting that Nishitani chooses the heretic mystic and the self-proclaimed antichrist at moments of crisis that react against something that happens within Orthodox theology that, however, Nishitani himself doesn't thematize so much. Because maybe I think he wasn't well versed in Catholic theology. He was familiar with Protestants, but he almost never reacts to Orthodox Catholic theology. Although it seems that the narrative that is guiding him for reading Western history is very much oriented towards what happens in this theological development and the reactions against this development. But he doesn't make that so much explicit.
Oh, so that it's and this seems already rather than having some kind of linear narrative, which in which the crisis is something that dialectic, like it seems very Hegelian, no? And so rather the crisis seems to be like a fractal. So like you have people that like live in a contradictory way in their own contradictory times, and then we can go back to them and see where this line of forces are, which seems to be very much more in theme with Nietzsche himself. So we want not just to say, oh, he's the end of this, but like he's an author full of contradictions because he lives in a contradictory time. And as we read and approach him, we're gonna necessarily focus on some of them because they're interesting to us, like Nishitani did. This seems way more interesting to me rather than giving this somewhat linear account of how things went.
I would concur also in the sense that with Nishitani in this text, although it is very short and for that reason lacking in meat but it's still, it seems that he's suggesting that rather what you just said in a fractal way almost, there is not just this linearity of development, but in a certain sense, just looking at these two crucial points in history, it seems that the same crisis is recurring. Which seems to be a crisis that, again,
it's essentially
tied, a crisis that seems to be essentially tied to this current of theological thinking. What he portrays as the crisis or the rupture between faith and reason, that seems to appear in almost essentially the same form after the collapse of Thomism and the Thomistic synthesis as it did after the attempt of Kant to suture or separate these two poles. But in any case, just one final remark to return to the other point from before, the vocabulary, and maybe it's really just semantics in regard to Schmidt's, but this emphasis on undivided or undividable relationship that also came up in your portrayal of his description of mystical experience. There also, I'm not sure how this maps onto what Nishitani is doing with his, rather the emphasis that it is about breaking through what he emphasizes as the dependence, for example, on God, or the interdependence on other subjectivity, and what I rather see as a kind of overcoming of precisely a kind of relational conception of that moment. Whereas this kind of rhetoric seems to more emphasize precisely the relationality as essential, where I hear him as more a kind of a kind of irrelational thinker. but that's just my, yeah, so.
I would say that probably, I mean, you could assess it better by like getting the whole thing, because when he's using like a Wunschpattern Beziehung is, for instance, like just waves. So that we might look and say, oh, it's a wave and a wave, and actually there's no point in which you could say, oh, one ends, they're just, like they're part of, they're the same thing. And even though we have the impression of different waves, we could never point at a specific moment of C. First of all, because it's dynamic, and secondly, because it's chaotic. So there's no point of distinction between wave and wave. They appear to us as something that might be in a connection, but they're not really in a connection. And that's his idea of a Beziehung. But it's a Schmitzian point. I think we don't need to go there.
Or to go to Alberto and Senchu.
I'm sorry. I was also taken by a comment at the beginning that there's a kind of theological side to what Nishitani is, but from a slightly different angle. If I were looking at Nishitani's philosophy of history, I wouldn't look to Nietzsche's eternal return for any guidance. He kind of ignores that when he deals with history. And if I were looking at the historical picture of where Eckart fit in, I would look to Rainer Sherman to begin there with the idea of the overcoming of the Onus Mundus, the transfer to the scientific worldview to Eckart. That's a sign. But to pick up your some final comments, I think the core of Nishitani's interest in theology is kenosis. He's not interested in salvation, a God who saves, and in God who judges. He's not interested in creation, divine election, or any form of predestination at all. The problem is the kenotic God is not dominant in the New Testament. You can read it back in, but this idea of God emptying himself in Jesus is to Philippians and finished. For Nishitani, that was pretty much everything. And I think that's the way he read Zarathustra. And I think that's the way he read the eternal return as kenosis. Let me put it this way. And to do it theologically. In the New Testament, we have this image, which I'm sure Nietzsche was aware of. Thinking of Jesus climbing the mountain with 3 disciples and being transformed. And they say, let's make an institution here. And he goes back down the mountain. So we have this people climbing the mountain is an image, I think, of the passion, what to use Sartre's term, the passion to be God. Nothing could satisfy a human being more than being completely self-sufficient, than being God. Nothing short of that would satisfy us. That's where the Bible begins. That's where the prophets always went up the mountain to be close to God. So the image of climbing the mountain is to get close to the world of the gods, or to become an Übermensch. It's a Übergehen. It's going up, right? But then Zarathustra, after his 10 years and goes through the experiences of despair and everything, he descends. Like Jesus decides, if you want to be like God, then you have to be like a God who wants to be like man. So there's a radical transformation there. The kenosis changes the idea of God. And the idea of you want to worship God, you want to be like God, then transform that passion into being a human being with all the suffering that goes with it. And the turning point for Zarathustra was when he overcomes pity. When he overcomes this idea of superiority towards human beings. So the eternal return, somebody indicated it, and I think it's really right. Aside from its historical, as Tobias mentioned, the epical idea of it, it's also a recurring pattern of the camel with its burden, the lion with its proud and will, and then returning to the innocence of the child and going through it again. Remember, Zarathustra becomes a camel a few times in the book, not just once, right? So for Nishitani too, this idea of frustration leading to despair, leading to nihility, and then leading to a self-empty is a process, a cycle. he called it fractal or fragmentary or something. I think that's a good image. It's something that goes on again and again. It's climbing this mountain, it's going back, this Übermensch, attitude and control of your life, and then all of a sudden the Untergang, where you come back and return to the world without any pity, return to the human condition. So it's not the Hegelian process of going somewhere, but just this continual eternal return. You get over one problem and the next problem arises. You go through this again and again. And for Nishitani, the only thing that kept that from despair, kept that circle alive from despair was self-emptying. And self-emptying is another name for love, and love is another name for God. So God must be self-empty, finished. I'm not interested in anything else about God. He doesn't quote any of it. Even in his writing on nature, he never refers to God. So I think there's your instinct was right, that there's something really radically Christian theological in Nishitani and in his way of reading Zarathustra.
I listened to your words. I remember the beginning of the this started sometimes with the high peak of the mountain, sometimes people the mountains. But sometimes, so it changes completely, and it is Uji.
When I was stressing how vertical this thing is, so of course, I mean, we have these metaphors of going up and down and the mountains, which are like also cross-cultural. But then the other thing, it seems to me, this is so much something dealing with the body, coming from the body, happening in the body, and this would be also like a way of reading this like embodied, like transcendence and descendance, just as breath, which also like connects it with like this as a state of increasing tension, like in elation, and a way of like in a literary sense of emptying, which also like is very much part of these like how much of these experiences of transcendence and like in loss of boundaries and like annihilation in several religious contexts, like I was using a quote from Dwanza, they're connected to this like sense of breathing, like being empty, being free in the moment of release, and an increasing of sense of like embodied tension as we go up. So and again, like, it comes. I could argue that specific points from the Zarathustra, but I think it's something that like Nietzsche is taking from. It's not limited to Nietzsche. I mean, in my understanding, actually, the first time I met the expression of vertical time is actually in the 1928 essay by Schuze, which is quoting together Nietzsche, Baudelaire, Basho, like Buddhism and so on. So like he's really making like a very bold cross-cultural pattern for this kind of like embodied verticality rather than circular.
Alberto, please.
I'm going to be very quick. Thank you very much, Lorenzo, for your beautiful presentation and of course for your beautiful slides. Slides, as always, I made some pics of them. And well, you often talked in your speech about atmospheres. You know, is an issue right now in Western philosophy, this theme of atmospheres. And in relation to Zarathustra, I would like to know if, in your opinion, there is a dominant kind of atmosphere linked to colors, to Stimmungen, and so on in the text, or an alternation of atmospheres in Das Spoke Zarathustra. And the other question was just about if you can clarify the
No.
Thank you very much.
I can clarify.
Sorry, you didn't hear me. Well, the connection or the difference between Beziehung and Verbindung.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. According to Smith.
Yeah, of course.
If he just decides to.
Of course.
Okay.
Thanks.
So thank you very much. It's a very welcome couple of questions. So the first thing, of course, I mean, I've been working with Griffith for years now. So for me, everything is as an atmosphere. I can do, you know, all of this, like all cleaning products. I can do everything with atmospheres, or I think I can. But yes, of course. I mean, I was stressing Nishitani is using the term atmosphere. Nietzsche has these like very atmospheric senses of like the stillest hour, the spider web, it's midnight, it's midday. I was putting the drunken song, which for me again, is this like eternity is an order. And coming to that, I mean, like I've been working on olfaction for what, like 4 years now, almost. And one of my impressions is like since I started collecting olfactory references in Nietzsche. So not just Stimmung, not just ambience, but really what happens, because he's like using a lot. He's like Nietzsche always saying, "Oh, my genius is in my nostrils, and I could smell lies and truth as nobody could before me." And again, even already in the Birth of Tragedy, he's saying, "Oh, there's like there's a smell of blood," which again is like, and using smell for him is a way of like breaking through an ontology of presence, because he's saying, "Oh, this violence is not there anymore. It's past, but it's there, because it's an older, because like our institutions, our values, and so on have this left from something that is gone." So again, like he's interested not only he's interested in smell because they are trans-temporal phenomena. So like smell is something. Again, I was talking with Baudelaire, but of course we had like, so his smells are Proustian. So the scent, the odor and the taste of the Madeleine is like one other example of a general return. So it's something that it can present itself with the same emotional strength in this vertical manner from a sunken state to again to a temporary, intensive like remanifestation, and then it's sink again. And coming to that, I mean, I started noticing some kind of like pattern. I was just checking every kind of notion, every recurrence of like Geruch, like and so on. And first of all, lots of things. So like when in Zarathustra is constantly calling for fresh air. So like, and so it's an oppressive thing, and there's lots of pain. Like he's breathing the fresh air, but then there's lots of God is dead. Can you not feel the smell? So like the most one of the central theological announcement of this mystic like religious elements of Zarathustra is a stink. So like he's feeling something that nobody else is seeing. He's feeling Diogenes with the lantern. But like we don't see the death of God. We should be able to smell it. So like I would say yes, this is not only very atmospheric, but according to Max Nordau, like who's like analyzing Nietzsche and his degeneration, according to Nordau, these kind of like olfactory hypersensitivity, something that like Stefan Zweig is arguing, something that Max Nordau is arguing in the Portraits of Nietzsche, that might be like a very, very physical symptom of nervous degeneration. And it's common in several authors. It's common in several biographies of people that end up having like psychiatric issues of several kinds. So this kind of like extreme focus and extreme intense sensation for something that's barely there. And again, like I mean, olfaction can also be seen in these like in several mystical experiences and so on, rather than visions. Very often, you know, just like this particular aura. Like the odor of sanctity coming from the body. So it's really related to be very much in the air. It's one of the, again, going back to the sense of elemental imagination, like material imagination, air is one of the ways in which we are already like moving from like concrete facts to like non-obstruction to a certain kind of like horizontal transcendence. That was the first question. Then about Beziehung and Verbindung. Schmitz is using that in a very technical sense. So I encourage the book is out. I mean, like it's a translation that I did with again, Professor Griffer from Rome. It's out with me since international. The collection is called Atmospheres. You're very welcome if you let me know if you want to read it. But
of course,
so Schmitz is like distinguishing again with his own terminology. So if we don't want to accept it, nobody's forcing us. But he's distinguishing between he's taking a Verbindung is a logical, kind of like voluntary or more or less voluntary, but it's still like I'm having two different objects and I'm creating a connection. And again, this is the kind of thing that easily, like mysticism is not about that. I mean, when say, oh, it's a unity between two things that are different. Everybody's saying, okay, yeah, no, this cannot be that. But then when he's saying Verbindung, that's a kind of a unity or it's an interaction that goes that precedes the independent existence of its faults. And according to Schmitt, some of these Verbindungen are unspaltbar. They cannot be easily divided. And again, one example that I can gather on the moment, let's say waves in the sea. Waves in the sea, I mean, we have the impression and we can distinguish different waves exist, but they are just like momentary configuration of one thing, and I can never say, oh, this is the end of one wave and the beginning of another, stricto sensu. I mean, they're just like in a unsplittable relationship with each other. Unspaltete Verbindung. That might be a good example. And again, like the ocean is another very mystical metaphor. So it kind of really relates to the whole topic.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo.
Last question. So,
Do you have time still?
Yes,
Have time? Okay, thank you so much. I have to say, I not know much about Nietzsche. No. I know nothing, almost nothing about Nietzsche, but it was very interesting, the lecture, especially the interpretation of the Sils Maria. You said something about the landscape. If I remember correctly, you said the excorporation into landscape. So I think the landscape, the concept of landscape is very important for example, in the lyrical poem or this landscape. And you also said in this poem or the sentences, the landscape hears. Or the deep dive into the undivided impression, something like that, if I remember correctly. So I always have some listening to that. I remember the phrase, the haiku Nishitani the quotes in his the Kutosoku, and for me it's very difficult to understand. The haiku means the bottom of loneliness falls off. Or the falling slit. The 寂しさの底抜けて降るみぞれから very famous one. But there, Nishitani said, it doesn't mean that one feels loneliness in front of this landscape. What it does not mean either the landscapes make me lonely. So can you explain why? From where these differences come, or if there are some differences in the Sils Maria and the Night of Zojo haiku, from where comes these differences?
Thank you. It's a very welcome question. I don't think there is much of a difference actually, because it's when especially Haikai, I mean the Joso, he's forcing it that haiku by Joso, one of Basho's disciples in Kutosoku, he's talking about, he really likes Basho, he wrote about starting from the 40s and then in the 50s and then in the 80s, he knows him really well. But there's another really, really beautiful haiku by Basho, which I cannot quote by memory right now, when it's like, but basically Basho is saying to a cuckoo bird, I say, take my pain and transform it into sabi. Transform it into loneliness. So pain from, like, let's say, my sadness would be construed as a personal feeling. So it's a kind of feeling that it makes me feel as distinct from my environment. But in the moment in which I'm like listening and I'm being, again, this according to Schmitz would be another excorporation in sound. So like I am fun listening, like if I'm in a forest, I'm listening to a bird singing, the loneliness that I feel as an ego, like let's say the mark of egoness, of the egoic mark that I can call loneliness, like that I can call sadness, is transformed. Sad is not even loneliness. I mean, it's a pattern of things. It's like the way in which everything, to rust means to be exposed to air. So it's to become one and to be transformed as something into an atmosphere. Rather to like stop being an object rusting is the negation of the independence of an object. Like it's oxidation. And so when he's saying, basically he's talking to the cuckoo and saying, come on, take my sad self and oxidize it. Transform it into something that is like has an essential relationship to everything else.
Do you see, you interpret the landscape heals me, for example, when I see that landscape. And can you also say the landscape is healed by me?
We clearly are in a situation which the healing is also I would rather say, well, the landscape is also killing me a bit.
No, landscape is healed by me.
By me. Yeah, I mean, the landscape doesn't need me as an ego, I would say. But yeah, I mean, we have this mutuality for sure. The landscape exists with me, rather. So like, but also like in the landscape, I can also like lose myself for a moment. So I'm not forced to be myself when I'm in a forest. Like a part of me is dying in that moment. That's the oxidation I was trying to say. So yeah, healing. I mean,
if you use the concept of healing, yeah.
But again, like because of course healing doesn't mean that I have a problem and I'll go to the landscape, I will fix the problem, and now I'll be more productive as I'm working for Google. Like, I mean, this sense of healing, this sense of mindfulness, it's deeply degenerate. But yeah, I mean, like we could say there's a mutual healing, there's a mutual. But what's this? I don't know if the landscape.
I remember one the poem, Zen Buddhist poem, which was written by a very famous Zen monk, and he said, "We all know the Zen monk gets satori when he saw a flower bloom, but we do not know that flower gets satori seeing that enlightenment of that monk."
Ah, wonderful.
Can we say this reciprocality?
I would say, yeah, or with Dogen when he's saying, that the mountains are like doing like explaining karma. Yeah, they would need also, there could be a mutual relationship. So if flowers and green mountains are explaining karma, they don't just do them for themselves. So yes, there is this kind of like nature is also coming towards us, and the healing in the senses and the healing of both. Yeah, I absolutely agree. But also, I mean, the how land, and that's one of the issues. I mean, like I would say, the problem with, say, with monotheism, like with religion, let's say, is that I don't see the same intensity. I don't see the same attention for phenomenal nature, like which is very strong. I mean, like at least in comparison, I mean, so much stronger in East Asian Buddhism. It's so much stronger in Taoism and so on. So that yeah, like how a central religious experience can be happening in the dealing with other forms of life, other forms of organic life, or the elements, and how. I mean, it's by no means completely absent, but like. I would say it has been like historically minoritarian in a Christian or even Islamic or even Jewish context. Like I'm sure that like I'm gonna be corrected immediately, but it seems minoritarian. I don't see the same availability. Because of this And there seems to be some kind of like anthropocentric, historical thought, how the strongest events the most meaningful events in a Christian context, let's say, would be the incarnation of Christ, not the blooming of a flower. And then that's one of the things that, again, I don't know how much Nishitani discussed about these different relationship toward landscape and nature, but it's for sure it's something that happens and happens also in Europe. And it's the romantic attention would be very much closer to the Zen tradition rather than
some sense, I think, yes.
rather than the theological tradition.
Yes, in some sense.
But I am ready to be corrected and I'm ready to be harshly corrected because probably it's too general a claim. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Lorenzo. I think it's time to close our first day on Nishitani. So we will start tomorrow at 9:30 in Japanese time. Some Eastern it's difficult, but for the time difference.
Coming back from like Bego parsing, they can at 3 a.m. and listen to us.
But anyway, we will continue tomorrow with morning and afternoon session. So if you are interested, please come join us. So thank you very much to everyone.